Hello and welcome to another episode of the University of Tasmania podcast. My name is Keegan Poposky. We are recording this on a Thursday morning, the 25th of June in beautiful Sandy Bay, the best state in Australia, my point of view, but we had a bit of rare bad weather this last week, but it's all going to be sunny from now on. Joined by another special guest, Professor Catherine Palmer. How you going?
Not too bad, Keegan, and I share your view that this is the best state.
Yeah, even though we've had bad weather, it opens up things like the disappearing tan.
Yeah.
So good things come, and I love Tassie.
Yeah.
But how have you been, even with COVID and all this?
I haven't been too badly affected. I must admit that I've been able to get out and run and ride, and I'm glad that the gyms have finally opened up in the last couple of weeks. So I haven't been too badly affected. I must admit. I do miss seeing my students. And the sort of their cold hard flesh as it were. So I'd be looking forward to the campuses more fully opening up.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of the students are keen to come back on and see the face-to-face teachers as well. Just a little bit about you for the listeners. So Catherine's an expert in the field of sociology and sport, has previously taught at the University of Adelaide, Flinders University, Durham University and Deakin, has taught anthropology, sociology, public health and sport and exercise departments. Catherine has done some work with the United Nations, Olympic Games, as well as a number of other governing bodies. Now, again, this is a completely condensed resume. Catherine's done plenty more than that, so I apologise for not doing you justice there. But certainly a fair bit with some impressive bodies, so I'm interested to see how the chat goes today. I want to go to you because people don't want to hear me talk. How did you end up here at UTAS?
Yeah, sure. Keegan, your potted history in the introduction gave a pretty good sense of how I arrived at UTAS. So I started out at the University of Adelaide. I did both my undergraduate degree there, Bachelor of Arts, then Bachelor of Arts with Honours, and then my PhD in anthropology. And for my PhD, I looked at the Tour de France, and I can come back to that a little bit later on. But that was my first teaching position, my first academic position. I then moved from the University of Adelaide in an anthropology department to Flinders University, where I taught in a public health department. I then moved to Durham in the United Kingdom, where I taught in a sport and exercise science department. I then came back to Australia and taught in a sociology department in a School of Social Sciences and Humanities. And from there, I moved to UTAS to take up the role as the inaugural head of the School of Social Sciences in 2013. And I think that journey also probably tells you a little bit about my research and my teaching, that I see myself, that movement, I guess, from anthropology to public health to sport to sociology to social sciences. So I see myself very much as an interdisciplinary social scientist who draws on research, interests and expertise and methodologies from all of those disciplines where I've worked.
That's excellent. I'm interested to know about how where your passion about sociology and anthropology and sport sort of came about. How did that happen?
Sure. So I've always been I was always a sporty kid. Played all of the kind of the usual suspect team sports. Hockey, soccer. Didn't play netball. And I was at primary school, so I got into sport and sociology through questioning some of the missed opportunities for girls. So into a conversation about gender equity. Mm-hmm. And so when I was at primary school, girls could play with the boys. That was not a problem at all. When I moved to high school, those opportunities for playing soccer, playing hockey, they then disappeared because there wasn't a girls' team. And so I started to question why. and that questioning of why led me to led me onto a kind of an intellectual journey, I suppose, about looking for what might be the structural and systemic and social barriers that prevent women from taking part in sport. And that's certainly an issue that's very much alive today. My interest in anthropology came from, like a lot of students in my first year of my arts degree. I did a subject, Introduction to Social Anthropology. Had no idea what it was. One of the examples that was used was it's an anthropological classic by an anthropologist called Clifford Geertz, and the example is called Deep Play, Notes on a Balinese Cockfight, and on the face of it, it's a story of cockfighting. But it's the twist in the tale in that it's not really about cockfighting, it's what the cockfight says about Balinese society, that it's not actually the birds that are fighting, but it's the men, it's the owners. And so it was using sport as a window onto bigger social issues. That was what really struck a chord with me, and I applied that kind of thinking to my PhD. Sort of as the cockfight is for Bali, the Tour de France is for France. So what does the study of a bike race say about French society and culture more broadly?
Interesting. Whilst you've touched on your PhD about Tour de France, we might go to that now. So you've sort of briefly described it, but what did you sort of cover there in your PhD, and then what were the results?
Yep, sure. So if I perhaps backtrack and tell you a little bit about how I did my PhD. So I spent 14 months in France of first-hand ethnographic fieldwork. I lived in a town called Grenoble, which, if you know your French geography, is on the base of the French Alps.
Okay. Yep.
And if you're a cyclist or a cycling fan or a Tour de France fan, you would know the names of the climbs like Alpe d'Huez, the Galibier, the Col d'Izoire. Yep. Grenoble was at the foothills for all of those classic climbs. And so it was an area of France where a lot of cyclists and so amateur and professional cyclists came to train and to race. And so my point of entry into the world of professional cycling was through an amateur cycling club and their interactions with the professional cycling world. So I joined that cycling club. I rode, I trained, I rode for 14 months, and through talking with cyclists, with the cycling teams, with the organising body of the Tour de France, I put together my PhD, and it was really about, in the context of globalisation. So bearing in mind this was 1993, 1994
Yes.
when I did my field work, when it was just starting to be the global event that we now see the Tour de France is, where we were just seeing riders from Australia come on, where we were just seeing riders from Colombia, Lithuania, all over the world really start to come into play. So I was interested in how French is the Tour de France in that context of globalisation, where you have riders from different countries, sponsors from the United States and so on, and to come back to the importance of those local experiences. It was the way in which that cycling club drew on the annual return of the Tour de France to make sense of themselves as cyclists through themes such as masculinity, the importance of landscape, so the Alps, and the way in which particular mythologies and stories were told about the local experience of cycling in the context of nationhood and nationalism, in that broader context of globalisation, was what I was really interested in.
No, it's interesting, and you enjoyed that PhD, no doubt.
Had a ball.
Yeah.
Had a ball.
Were you based in France?
Yep,
when you
so I lived there
14.
for 14 months, so
Yeah.
I had to return to my high school French days and sort of brush up on my French.
Yeah.
And it was it sounds like I just rode my bike around France for 14 months, but it was probably in terms of hard slog. It was kind of a very very hard time.
How did you end up in France, and did you because you were in Adelaide doing your arts, and then you ended up in France?
Yep. So my PhD was through the University of Adelaide, and I just did my field work.
Okay.
There for 14 months.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Excellent. At the moment, obviously, we're coming into a bit more normality, but not really, with COVID-19 happening. I'm interested from your point of view, from social issues and sport, about how that may impact the sporting environment, especially here in Tasmania or across Australia. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure, and I think there's no question that COVID-19 has just changed the game in everything that we do, be that work, be that play, be that sport, be that leisure. And I think we're just starting to see what some of those implications are likely to be. Contact sport, we're already seeing some of the issues and the consequences of that with the AFL at the moment, around the stringencies of COVID-19 testing, around restrictions on the number of fans that can be at a game, and so on. So I think we will continue to see as restrictions are eased and then not eased, whatever the word is. And I think we'll see some changes to the ways in which sport is practiced, the ways in which some of the rules might need to be modified. I think we'll just see a number. But I also think we're seeing already some of the effects on community sport in particular, and grassroots sport in particular, with the shutdown and the layoff of a number of key workers in sport and sports development roles, community sport roles. Whether we see a shift away from club sports, team sports, club sports and so on, to more individual sports that aren't reliant on club fees, or the restrictions that go with contact sport and team sports. We might see a shift to more individual sports, outdoor sports as opposed to indoor sports. That's all really up in the air and a really evolving and fast-moving space.
It's interesting, like Australian sport's obviously been built on volunteers, and I think it's going to be one of those times where we're just going to have to embrace it a lot more with the volunteers, because, like you said, those paid positions probably aren't going to be there. I'm interested in regards to, from a sociology point of view, how a lot of the average Joe may be really keen for their weekend sport, or watching the Cats play on TV, and having that just being pulled away from them for a number of months, how that may impact them. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. As an Adelaide girl, I should start by saying watching the Crows or the Power.
Yeah.
But no, I think our reaction to the absence of sport has been really, really telling, and I think the fact that we speak about sport not being being on either on the television or being able to play it ourselves. I mean, we speak about that as though there's been a death. We talk about mourning the absence, mourning the loss, and I think that absence provides a way into thinking about why does sport matter so much to us here in Australia, here in Tasmania. What does that say about what we value, about what we hold dear as a state or a nation? And I think it is some of those values that we espouse and we like to see in sport, around teamwork, around mateship, and we can kind of over-valorise and and big up some of those values. But I think and sport is a fantastic distraction as well, and that is something that we all need desperately at the moment as well.
Yeah, definitely. It probably leads on to our next topic pretty well, but you've done some previous research on, I guess, the the athlete's approach to activism, and it's something that's very relevant at the moment, especially with the Black Lives Matter. We see it in the AFL, and then especially obviously in the United States. Do you want to talk a little bit about what your research was before we delve into the modern situation?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't researched that activism so much as that I was interested in some of the ways in which sport is used by charity foundations to promote particular lines of activism and advocacy, and that actually tracks right back. I mean, I think probably the first example or public example that we saw of kind of sport and politics really coming together in a form of advocacy and activism for a social justice or a racial justice moment was at the Mexico Olympics with that classic, iconic image of the Black Power salute. And I think what's interesting about that Black Power salute was the silver medalist, who was an Australian. A guy called Peter Norman, and in the run-up to that, John Carlos and Tommy Smith, who were the two African American Black Power athletes, they took Norman aside and said, "We're going to protest, we're going to salute. Up to you what you do." And he said, "I will support you."
Yeah.
And he wore a Sport for Human Rights badge on his tracksuit. As a result, he was excommunicated from the Australian Olympic Committee. I think it was the 72 Olympics, so the next one. Australia chose not to send any sprinter at all, rather than send Peter Norman, despite Norman kind of blitzing all of the Olympic qualifying times. And it wasn't then until I think it was 2012 when the Australian government issued Norman with an apology for how appallingly he'd been treated for taking a stand. So that's a kind of a bit of a backstory, but it gets to the point that for a long time athletes were discouraged from taking a stand about any kind of social justice issue because it was seen as being bad for business. So team managers, sponsors and so on said, "Look, just keep your head down. This is really not..." So athletes were seen as being neutral, and what we've seen in the Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, and the way in which that has been taken on as a symbol of solidarity for Black Lives Matter shows just how that's kind of spun right around where athletes are willing to publicly lend their voice, lend their public profile to issues that matter not only to them but to people more broadly.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's almost like, I'm obviously not an expert, but like in some circumstances, if you're an athlete that's not speaking out at the moment, it is being noticed, as opposed to back in the day, or even just recently with Colin Kaepernick, there wasn't that support for him when he was doing it. And I think it's worth remembering, taking a stand can have real personal and financial consequences. So Kaepernick was sacked and he remains unemployed. He received death threats. So that does not come without a personal and a financial price to pay. We're not seeing that. We're seeing a different mood, I suppose, now with the Black Lives Matter. But it has its origins, and and we owe a kind of a great deal of kind of legacy to that really brave stand that the people like Kaepernick, like the 68 Black Power saluters, and Peter Norman. We owe a tremendous legacy to their courage. Yeah, I think you mentioned earlier before we recorded, Muhammad Ali was another one as well, who he threw it into the river. Yeah,
so he threw his gold medal into a river when he was refused service into a whites-only restaurant in the United States.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that comes along. I want to touch base a little bit. Do you have any other thoughts on that topic before we move on, or...?
Oh no, the only other point I would add to that is, it was really pleasing and heartening, I suppose, to see the number of AFL players and rugby players who, once football suddenly sort of came back into our lives, to see the number of players who took a knee in the centre of the ovals ahead of the games last weekend, I think it was, and I know that a number of those players weren't able to attend the Black Lives Matter rally because of the quarantine restrictions.
Yeah, I think that's amazing, especially like it wasn't that long ago that Adam Goods wasn't showing the support that he should have.
Yeah.
And then also I think the Collingwood players speaking out at the moment. So I sort of assume that a lot of these things haven't happened recently, but they have, and it's very recent.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
It's great to see that the AFL and like the rugby players are making a stand on that. And obviously all the players are doing it as well, which is fantastic. Your future research projects, I know you've got a big interest in fitness philanthropy. The average listener may not know what that means. Do you want to explain that one?
Yep, sure. So fitness philanthropy is really looking at the interconnections between sport and charity, or in kind of shorthand, the rise of the rise of the charity sports event. And so, probably not at the moment, but in the not so recent past, not a weekend went past without the roads being closed for a fun run, a bike ride, some kind of fitness-based event in which participants raised money for a whole range of charity causes, be they that cancer research, homelessness, a whole heap of kind of health and social issues. And so I'm interested in what can explain that rise in sports-based charity, as a particularly unique social and philanthropic undertaking that brings together questions around kind of health and well-being, but also questions, and this is the more sociological bent, but also questions around kindness and generosity and citizenship and civic engagement.
Do you have any predictions about what you may find in that, or?
No, not at this stage. But I think what's been interesting with COVID is the way in which things like the Mother's Day Classic or the Melbourne Marathon, or pick your charity event, they've all had to move online, and that has changed the nature of the experience. That one of the really wonderful things about these kinds of events is that collective coming together and people really feeling a kind of a sense of community that's in person. Whether that kind of how people feel differently about those experiences, whether numbers decline, whether I think we're just waiting to see what unfolds there.
No, that'll certainly be interesting. I think there's some potential opportunities for PhD candidates in a study about women in alcohol in sport. Do you want to explain that one a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Yep. So, with a colleague from the University of Otago in New Zealand, Professor Steve Jackson, we've received funding from the Australian Research Council for a 3-year project to look at women and alcohol in Australian sport. And the thinking behind that is that there's been an awful lot of research that's been done that has looked at men and alcohol and sport, and particularly some of the bad behaviour that goes with that. There's been absolutely no research that's looked at women's experiences of attitudes towards usage of alcohol in sport in Australia, and yet we are seeing an increasing number of women athletes across a whole number of sports. So we're really keen to just get some baseline data about attitudes, about the extent to which, about the kinds of usage patterns that may or may not be there. As part of that project, there are 2 funded PhD scholarships that are currently advertised on the University of Tasmania website. They're for 3-year project. The other bit that's not quite advertised yet is for 2021 there will also be 2 honours scholarships, and people can get in touch with me if they're interested in taking an honours year that's funded for, I think it's about $3,000 per project for that.
Excellent. So once I post this, do you mind if I have your email address on
Yep.
there? Yep, no worries. So for any of the listeners that may be interested in taking up what are those topics or the honours, Catherine's email information will be in the info section of the Spotify or wherever you're listening to this. No, that's interesting. I think we're almost out of time. Is there anything else you want to touch on any of the topics, or?
Only to give a shout out for 2 pieces of teaching that I'm involved with. So if you are interested in the relationships between sport and social issues, as part of the Wellbeing Toolkit, there is going to be a sport and social issues module that will be available for semester 2 and for the next intake of participants for that. For students who are enrolled at the University of Tasmania, I teach a unit in spring called Sport and Crime, and that looks at the intersections between sport and crime, both the ways in which sport is a place where all kinds of criminal behaviour gets played out, violence, match fixing, doping, the list goes on, but also the ways in which sport is also used as an intervention in crime prevention and crime reduction strategies, and some of the contradictions that sit in that relationship between sport and crime. It's great fun to teach, never-ending supply of examples to draw on.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I'll put that information on the info section as well. But a big thank you to yourself for coming in and taking time out of, no doubt, your very busy schedule at the moment. But yeah, thank you for coming in again, and thank you to the listeners for joining the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Keegan.